the Ukrainian war has completely changed the situation in Europe. There's two different features about the Ukraine war. In the immediate sense, it's going to make a very unpleasant situation in Europe. We can be absolutely certain that there's going to be very high prices for energy that is going to result from the Ukraine war. We know this already. There may be actual physical shortages of supply, but that's not absolutely certain. It's a risk in the situation. So this is going to be the case. We already have large demonstrations, and we have unpopularity of governments. Most governments are deeply unpopular, whether they're the right. For example, the right-wing government in France and Macron lost at the parliamentary elections to a left-wing coalition. On the contrary, in Italy, because the centre-left was in power, that's been replaced by the right wing. In Britain, the right wing is in power, but now the left wing is enormously ahead in the opinion polls. What really is happening is that whoever is in power, it doesn't matter whether they're right wing or left wing, is very, very unpopular. So that's the first thing that we can be absolutely sure. Secondly, the war has reshaped the geopolitics of Europe in several senses. Firstly, of course, this is by far the biggest war that has taken place in the European continent since World War II. Europeans, as they've been through more than 70 years of peace, there were some small conflicts, for example, in Yugoslavia, but Yugoslavia is a small country. I don't want to sound prejudiced against Yugoslavia, but it's a small country. Whereas Russia and Ukraine are very big countries. So the Europeans really got to think for 70 years that major war is something that couldn't happen in our continent. It was something which had happened in history, and that was very bad, but we now got into an era of peace. This is now quite changed. The consequences of war are already direct in the sense that there are now millions of refugees from Ukraine. That is affecting the situation in Europe. There is the talk of the use of nuclear weapons in Europe, which of course is very frightening for the population. And that's a big change in, therefore, the psychology of the continent. And then thirdly, there is an objective change in the relation of Europe to the United States, because the United States created the Ukraine war. Don't have any illusions about this. The policy which the United States wanted was to expand NATO into Eastern Europe and into the Ukraine. It knew that this was very provocative and dangerous for Russia, and several very leading politicians and analysts in the United States, for example, Kennan, who was the original architect of US Cold War policy, said this is a very dangerous and irresponsible policy. And the United States should have been able to work this out very simply. Let's take a comparison. In 1962, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States made clear that to have Soviet missiles in Cuba, that is with only a few minutes striking time of Washington and other United States centers, was absolutely unacceptable for the military defense of the United States, so much so that it was prepared to have a nuclear war in order to prevent the Soviet missiles being in Cuba. It said, no, there is no compromise, it is out. Get the missiles out or else. Now, to its great good sense, the Soviet leadership, which had engaged in something which was not a good idea, withdrew the missiles from Cuba. But the Ukraine is closer to Moscow than is Cuba to the United States, to the centers of the United States. So the United States was therefore asking Russia to accept something which the United States had made quite clear it was prepared to have a world war and a world nuclear war in order to prevent. It was not difficult to work out that this would be completely unacceptable for Russia. And therefore, this has created a very, very dangerous situation. This is a big escalation of US policy. Previously, we may say since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States has been willing to carry out wars against developing countries. So it had the bombing of Serbia in 1999. It had the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. It had the invasion of Iraq in 2003. It had the bombing of Libya in 2011. It had intervention in Syria basically for the last 10 years. But these were against developing countries. This was very unjust, but none of these developing countries could militarily fight the United States. So therefore, the United States was very safe. This time, the United States has been prepared to risk a confrontation with a very powerful nuclear armed state. So this is a big escalation of US policy. And it's also very dangerous, obviously, from the point of view of China, because if the United States is willing to have risk a confrontation with a major nuclear armed state such as Russia, it may be willing to risk a confrontation with a major nuclear armed state such as China. And this therefore gives very sinister, very dangerous interpretation to policies of the United States around Taiwan, for example. So therefore, the war in Ukraine has destabilized our continent economically and politically. It's destabilized it psychologically from the threat of war, and it's destabilized it from the point of view of relations with the United States. And this has had big effect on countries like Germany. Some people, there's even a saying that the real goal of the war is against Germany, because Germany has now been forced to stop buying cheap Russian gas, and it will be forced to buy more expensive United States gas. And this is going to damage Germany's economy and be good for America. So the Ukrainian war has completely changed the situation in Europe.